Yeah, so I think there are three big forces to keep your eye on. And when you see them in their cycle, then it's clear. First, are you earning more than you are spending?
And do you want people to look at this at an individual level or at a country level?
Well, you can at both. I want them to look at it as the country, but the country is nothing more than the aggregate of the people. And so when you look at those three forces, I want to make sure that they're clear and you could align them up and you could see where you are. Is the country earning more than it's spending and building savings, or is it spending more than it is earning and creating debt? Because one man's debts are another man's assets. And when somebody is holding those assets and they're producing a lot more of that money in debt, they go down in value. Money goes down in value as they produce it to produce that buying power. And then that gets people bad returns, it produces a higher amount of inflation, and it produces bad returns for holding debt or bond. So in other words, cash or bonds. And then people get out of cash and bonds, and that produces rising interest rates while there's rising inflation, and that produces stagflation. So I want them to get the mechanics of that, because that's happening now. You could see it. This is not controversial. We are producing a lot of debt. We're spending a lot more than we're earning. And as a result, they're printing a lot of money. And the printing of a lot of money creates a lot of inflation. And with that inflation, then nobody wants to, cash is trash. You don't want to hold cash. And you get out of that. And that causes rates to rise. And that's one of those three factors. So you can see it happening, and you could also see the cycle of it as shown in the book. The second force that is dealing with is the internal conflict force, how you are with each other. Are you operating cohesively, common mission, and moving in the right direction, the system working? Or are you at each other's throats? Is the system threatened? Because history has shown when the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. And that is a risky situation. It's a risky situation because it produces disorder, and it can produce a form of civil war. And at those times, when you have that, you see greater and greater polarity. In politics, it shows up at greater and greater populism of the left and populism of the right. And populists want to fight for their side. They're not moderates. Moderates want to work together to try to find a compromise that's best for the whole. Populists appeal to their crowd by saying, I am fighting for you, and they will fight each other. And that fight can be at the threat of the system. So in history, for example, we saw 4 democracies in the 1930s choose to become dictatorships as one side fights to the other because they become so disorderly. And we have a system right now that you could see that it is possible in elections that neither side might accept losing. And so the system becomes in jeopardy. And you see that the moderates leave the system. You can't be moderate. You have to pick a side and fight. And so you see this in the French Revolution. There were moderates in the early part of it, that recognizing that there were problems and wanting to work together. The moderates got guillotined. The polarity began. The same was true in the Russian Revolution. The same was true in the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and so on. Those polarity gets greater and greater as there's a greater intensity to fight. And that is the internal piece. And so you could see where we are in that internal piece. Right now, we see that moderates are dropping out of choosing not to run for re-election. And you're seeing in the primary system that the fight is who's over most extreme in representing that. And you're seeing this greater polarity. And you see it reflected in many statistics something like 10 or 15%, I forgot if it's 10% of the Democrats or if it's 10% of the Republicans, I don't remember, versus 15% wish the members of the other party would die. They don't want them to measure they don't want them to marry their children. I mean, there is a great polarity, and you're seeing that lead to changes in where people live. They're moving to different areas, not just because of tax reasons, but because of differences in values. And so that kind of, you can see it today happening, these things, but you also can see the arc of them in the book because it measures statistics. It shows these things happening. So when you have a financial problems and you have this kind of polarity and you have a bad time, you have a lot of fighting internally. So imagine where we are in the economic cycle. We're in the part of the economic cycle where they have given, the government has given a lot of money and credit to people. They've put it out. Well, no surprise, that's leading to a lot of inflation, okay? Inflation takes buying power away from people. And it also means that then there's going to be higher interest rates, and that's going to squeeze people. And so that makes that wealth gap and that wealth issue more difficult. So that's the second force. And the third force is the rise of a great power, the geopolitical force that's going on, that we're seeing today with China and Russia and so on, and how that's changing. Because when the power of a country diminishes, okay, when we get weaker financially or how we are with each other and so on, there are greater vulnerabilities. And there's always the competitive power that learns how to become stronger. And competition always happens. There's the establishment and then there's the new competition. And as they get stronger in all ways, militarily and commercially and so on. And that's the dynamic that we're seeing. The events that happened in the Ukraine, and that is bringing all this development internationally up at a little bit quicker pace. It's the same dynamic. There are two sides, and there'll be neutral countries, just like in the war. There was the Allies and the Axis powers, and then there would be neutral countries. And so that part is developing. The U.S. Conflict part is probably progressing a little bit quicker. So, I mean, let's say the odds of that. On the world order, the developments in the Ukraine, maybe I should put those in perspective. Would you like me to do that?
Please, absolutely.
Okay. There is a very close relationship, a common objective of the Russians and the Chinese. So there is a competition in the world, and there's a dominant world power which is perceived as being overly controlling. So the Chinese believe that the policy of containment of the United States, in other words, just right within their borders, that there isn't a region that's suitable for them, in much the same way as the United States. There's always a geographic region that is an area of influence. The United States in the area like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba, when there's a threatening power in Cuba, we reacted to that. That kind of geopolitics, they believe that the United States is sort of containing them, and they are growing in power, so that there's that dynamic. And Russia has the same kind of view, and so that there's a common, let's call it enemy, competitor. And there are 5 types of wars. There's a trade war, there's a technology war, there's a geopolitical influence war, there is a capital war, and then there's a military shooting war. And we are in the first 4 of those wars. in this competition.
With China or with Russia?
With China. Well, we're not in a shooting war with China. We are in a shooting war of sorts with Russia and the Ukraine. We're providing arms, and so they're shooting, and so there's a military war going on, and we're in it in our way. So we're at those particular spots, and the capital war is sanctions. We hear the notion of sanctions, and what that means is they're economic, and the way they work is to shut off, to produce economic pain by either not letting them get at their money or not letting them get to goods that they can import. And these have happened through time. In Japan, that was what set us up for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because the United States cut off Japan's oil supply, was in the process of doing that, and also confiscated its bonds, much the same way is happening now. And that put them into a corner that led them to bomb Pearl Harbor, and then we went to a military war. So that's where we are now. And that also is risky because it threatens the value of the dollar. Because right now, debt is dollars. Any currency, the way you hold it is you hold it in the form of debt. You don't hold it just in paper. And because there's a rising inflation, and because there's a lot of printing of money, and because there's also a greater fear on a number of countries that they too could be sanctioned,